Good afternoon. My name's Stuart Barrow, occupational therapist, managing director of Promoting Independence and OTAC Webinars. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for number one of 4 sessions with the fantastic Disabled Living Foundation, an impartial charity that are here to provide a fantastic service over the next coming months. Today's webinar is part of the DLF for Professionals programme that aims to provide people with the impartial information, tools and training they need to support older and disabled people to live independently at home. So like myself, most of you may be occupational therapists, technical officers, OT assistants, or occupational therapy personnel. So you're in the right place, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be sharing a taste of the material that will be covered in the Home Adaptations for Professionals 5-day modular course, along with insights from the speakers based on their own experiences as specialists in the field. The webinars are introduced today by Claire Barber, who's the Professional Service Manager for the Disabled Living Foundation. And the speaker today will be Marney Walker, who will deliver a talk on adapting kitchens and factors to consider with some tips and some impartial guidance. As you know, with all our webinars, there's no sales pitches, there's no direction to go anywhere that would make you think, oh, I should use this company or that company. Today's session is completely impartial. It's here for you to ask any questions. If you've got some technical questions, some occupational therapy questions, even some case study sort of issues, or a client you're working with at the moment, please do pop it in the chat box. Ask as many questions as you like. We're here to serve and support you. As you're probably aware, the session will last up to an hour, so we will close by 2 o'clock. If there's any questions or anything after 2 o'clock, or we get close to 2 o'clock and there seems to be some questions that need answering, we will answer them as best as we can, but we will then continue with the chat box and send you the responses afterwards. So don't worry at all. In terms of certificates, you will receive an email within 48 hours with the link for your certificates. And if there's any problems, please do come back to me about that. And in relation to the webinar, there will be a recording of the webinar afterwards, and that will be sent to you via Disabled Living Foundation's team. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you across to Claire Barber, Professional Services Manager for DLF.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you everybody for joining us today, especially so close to Christmas. I appreciate you all must be very busy. So today we are doing a case around practical assessment for home adaptations, but firstly I want to introduce you to the charity if you're not aware of it. So the DLF has been around for 50 years now and provides impartial information and advice to over 2 million people annually, mostly on the elderly and ageing population. But we focus on independent living and we give advice around practical aids, adaptations and technology. Motto is adding life to years through practical advice. All our advice is impartial and written by occupational therapists or similar in the field. So our services include Living Made Easy, which is an online marketplace with over 10,000 products from over 950 retailers. And it has the products surrounded with advice, articles and case studies to help support choice for the public. It has guides for choosing, and it will have simple aids that can be purchased by clicking through, and it will take you to online retailers to be able to purchase products. If you have difficulties finding which product would be suitable, then we have Ask Sarah, which is a rapid self-assessment tool. It has a choice of 90 plus daily living topics and provides a personalised report once the person has gone through the system, answering some basic yes or no answer questions to provide a very personalised report with answers and information around products that might assist somebody to live more independently. All the advice is authored by occupational therapists, and I don't know if you're all aware, but we can do a range of custom versions and have some live already with people like Carers UK, Newcastle and Equip You that are live at the moment. We also have DLF for Professionals, which is our professional range of services aimed at people who prescribe equipment. And in 2021, we'll be launching our new DLF for Data prescribing tool, which will replace the old DLF Data, which for those of you who have been around for a little while, replaced the Hamilton Index back in the, 20 plus years ago. Sorry, making you feel old if that's you. We also run conferences such as the Moving and Handling People Conference, which will be held in 2022, COVID allowing. We also have a suite of training courses called Trusted Assessor, which are accredited courses and enable people to learn how to assess for equipment provision, adaptations, not in replace of an occupational therapist, to support an occupational therapist's role. But we also have courses for occupational therapists to help provide consistency, but also to help with learning new skills or CPD. I'm an OT myself, aware that sometimes when you're moving areas, it can be difficult to know the right thing to do. So we offer those courses as an open course where you can book on independently, or we can provide commissioned courses to your organisations where you can book multiple people onto the session that's delivered in your own area at your own time and bespoke to your specific needs. The thing that you're seeing today, or the presentation you're seeing today, is based actually on one of our courses. So we have Home Adaptations for Professionals training. It's a 5-module course. It's accredited at level 5. And the modules include access to the home, kitchen design, bathroom design, multiple levels, including things like stair lifts and through floor lifts, and understanding plans and grants. So the training enables you to get a full range of adaptation training, but you can also specify specifically 3 modules to get the accreditation. So it might be that you're interested, obviously in today's kitchens, so it might be kitchens that you're interested in, and you can take those courses as a standalone CPD accredited session. So today we're focusing on the kitchen design part, and today Marney's going to be delivering just a small snippet of that, with Marney's fantastic spin on it. And the module looks at the considerations in the kitchen that includes things like layouts and specifics around appliances. But I will not go on any further because I'm sure you're here to listen to Marney do the brunt of the work for me today. So I'm going to hand over to Marney and say thank you ever so much for Stuart for hosting this for us today, and thank you to Marney for delivering it. And here she is delivering the kitchens part of our Home Adaptations for Professionals.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here to have the chance to talk to you about this subject, kitchens in particular, and it does feel rather strange to actually be sitting in my kitchen delivering this, and I can only imagine that very many of us are doing the same working from home. So it may be easy to think about this subject. As Claire explained, this is just a small section of a whole day training session on kitchen adaptations, which covers the whole process involved in assessment and recommendations for kitchen adaptations. A training session would obviously involve participation and chance to do practical exercises, but for this session, we're just focusing on some things to consider about how to consider physical ability in terms of how to measure the person in the space. And if it's a major adaptation that is needed, ultimately you will be working with surveyors and kitchen providers to come up with detailed solutions. But you don't have to be an expert in technical drawing to be able to take key measurements and sketch layouts, and that will help in your discussions with the person about what might work before you start working with technical experts. And within the time we have, we won't be covering in detail all the other factors that need to be considered, of course, in terms of sensory and cognitive impairments. Oh, sorry. I'm having a little problem with the slides, so I've missed that's it. Thank you. Compared to bathroom and access adaptations, kitchens can be much more complex. This is where we as occupational therapists can use our core skills, how we consider the person, their priorities, and the barriers to what they have to be able to what they have in their environment to be able to do what they want to do in the context of their lives. Their occupational roles as a parent, partner, working, a carer, living alone, living with a partner, living with a big family, everyone's different. And it will involve an analysis of the tasks and activities that they need to be able to do. And in terms of the environment, there are obviously a lot of different elements in terms of space, layout, and the location of the utilities to consider. So before considering how much and what kind of adaptation is needed in the kitchen, first you need to be discussing with that person what they want to be able to do and the levels of complexity in that particular situation. And a useful way to think about this is to consider whether they're going to be having light use of the kitchen, which might be breakfast, snacks, hot drinks, that might only need a little bit of accessible worktop and ability to reach the fridge, the sink, and operate a kettle or a toaster. Or it might be more medium use, where they need to be able to prepare a hot meal for themselves each day, and that might involve perhaps something like providing a small worktop oven or more accessible storage. And on a continuum, as part of a family, they might be somebody who needs to and wants to be able to provide many different kinds of meals and snacks throughout the day and for other members of the household. But before you consider recommending significant adaptations, of course, depending on the environment, you might also be able to do some simple things to advise on rearranging the storage, placing key items within reach, advising on how certain tasks can be adapted, using a table for food preparation, thinking about energy conservation, and maybe some simple equipment that can make food preparation much easier. There are also obvious risks associated with using kitchens, and this is part of your assessment. However, as the Royal College of OT guidance clearly outlines in our assessment approach, it should all be about embracing risk and enabling choice. Core to our practice is risk assessments, and it's about being proportionate and person-centered, working with the person to recognize the risks and how they can be reduced. In terms of measuring, you also need to consider other users in the home, what their needs are, and whether your adaptations might impact on the ability to complete those tasks, and what space the person needs to complete the task. Thank you. So, the activities in the kitchen are not just focused on food preparation. As you all know, when you have to think about when you've prepared the food, where are you going to eat it? You need to consider the person's ability to lift, carry and transfer safely hot drinks and meals. This layout actually shows a useful addition to a typical layout with a continuous surface with a space underneath that might serve as a dining area. But many kitchens won't have that kind of layout. You've got to think about the other things that people might be doing in a kitchen. They might have pets, they need places for feeding the pets, they might be entertaining and playing with children. And depending on the size, now that very many of us are working from home, maybe you're now using your own kitchen to work in. Sorry, the slide keeps that. Could you go to, thank you. I think, thanks. So when thinking about kitchen design, we need to consider the person's normal patterns of movement for completing different tasks. And it's well worth factoring in the time to do assessments that allow people to demonstrate how they do these tasks so that you can observe them in practice. In terms of the space and comfortable reach, we need to consider first whether they'll be sitting or standing, how much they are able to do and for how long. If they're standing and they're reliant on a mobility aid for support, for example, this person here is therefore having to do things one-handed. How much do those mobility aids take up if someone's using a walking frame or a rollator or a wheelchair? They might also be reliant on leaning on the worktop. You have to consider standing tolerance, standing balance are obvious factors, and you need to think about how that's going to impact on their need when they're concentrating. So it's all very well being able to stand for a certain amount of time, but of course the point about kitchens is that you're concentrating, you're doing things that maybe have particular risks associated with them that are obvious related to spills and burns, but also using knives sharp knives and so on. So all those factors you need to consider on how long someone actually is able to stand. If they're using a wheelchair, this has a very obvious impact on how much you're able to reach, especially if you can't, if there isn't space under the counters. But also, like this gentleman here with the using the wheelchair at the hob, it's well worth thinking about extraction, for example, and the fact that your face is much closer to the you might be getting a face full of steam, or you might be more vulnerable to hot fat splashing on your face. Also, as I've said earlier, if you're planning adaptations where there's more than one person in the household, then you have to consider the arrangement and heights of worktops and how they might have to be adjustable. Can you put the next slide on, please? Thank you. So to measure reach in standing, at the outset, the person needs to be comfortable with their feet flat on the floor. And as you know, even things like footwear can be a factor in contributing to people's ability to stand and possibly risk of falls. You need to consider their ability to reach up, forward, down, to the sides, and so on. And within these measurements, you need to be considering comfortable and functional reach. So, for example, to reach into a cupboard and get things out will also depend on grip and strength. Heights of wall cupboards are a particular issue, for example, for older people, where conditions common in aging, such as arthritis, impact on grip strength, and people talk about reaching up for a jar of coffee that slips out of their hand because they can't sustain the grip to get it down. So it's not just about measuring range of movement. All these measurements you need to be taking in relation to functional activities. Also, in relation to bending down, you need to consider the person's ability to bend or reach beyond their center of gravity into cupboards, and also whether they have the strength then to lift something quite heavy out of them. It's about the ability to move to complete tasks that should be safe and easy. If you think about the way you use a kitchen, typically to carry out tasks in the kitchen, we're turning and swiveling. And as indicated here, you need to consider that space, the way you're turning around and moving between different utilities to complete the tasks. You also need to take account for the need for particular equipment, such as mobility aids or perching stools. And we also need to look at what we mean by an effective working triangle that can minimize excessive to and fro around the kitchen, which can also in its turn lead to spills and trips, as well as impact on how much energy we're using and support our ability to concentrate on the tasks we're trying to complete. All these measurements will inform your recommendations that you make for the design of the adaptation. And a principle I've used in kitchen adaptations and design is that many issues related to making it easier, safer, and more convenient to use a kitchen can be resolved by accessible storage. It's about putting storage in, incorporating into the kitchen things like pull-outs and pull-down storage that brings things within reach, makes it safer to handle them and so on. So those measurements, all these measurements are very important when you're making a case for provision of features like that in a kitchen adaptation. But if standing for any length of time is a real issue, then you need to be considering how to measure and assess for somebody who's going to do most of it sitting down. Have the next slide, please. Sorry about this. Okay, so how do we measure? Obviously, as I've said, it's much better if you can measure someone in their kitchen. And this helps us to see what changes need to be made, if any, to support this person to have greater access in their own kitchen. We can consider how they reach and access essential appliances and resources. and also how the existing environment impacts on their ability. For example, where things are stored, the orientation of doors, type and location of plugs, switches and taps, things that you kind of forget if you're just relying on a checklist or something. So real functional assessment's best. Have the next slide, please. So this is an example of watching somebody make a cup of tea, for example, to see the natural way that people move in doing those tasks and whether they are actually able to do what this person's doing here and crouch down or not to get things out of a cupboard. Have the next slide, please. So if we're going to measure someone seated, the person who needs to sit down owing to fatigue to do these tasks, they may use a chair, a perching stool, or they may be using a wheelchair. Just like a standing user, we have a number of measurements to consider in terms of this diagram, range of movement, and so on. And access to things like being able to reach to a cupboard, load a washing machine, a dishwasher, access base units, and use a food preparation area. And some wheelchair users, for example, will have a limited trunk stability and strength and can tip out of a wheelchair if they reach too far forward, especially if this involves lifting something at the same time. And a key principle to consider is that the least effort is involved where the arms are supported on the worktop and key items can be accessed without the need to lift. So consider that person's ability to move, reach down, reach up, and out of the center of gravity. In terms of the turning space, the space to turn around, to turn or move on the spot, or to move between facilities to complete the task and maintain reach and stability, as well as space to move around the room and between existing facilities. Body shape might also be a factor that you need to take into account. Whilst it's important for someone who's using the kitchen standing, the body can move to compensate a bit more for the differing build. But when they're seated, and the size of your stomach may impact on how close the person can get to the surfaces, if there is space under the surfaces. Or if sitting side on, the larger frame of the person may limit their proximity to the work surface and in effect shorten their reach. Frequent changes in position may also impact on their energy and tolerance. Another key measurement, of course, if you're sitting, is knee height from the floor to the top of your lap. And this will impact whether the user can get up close to the kitchen unit and get their legs comfortably underneath if there is space. It's also worth considering whether you might need a height adjustable section of the kitchen, as for some people, things like changes in wheelchair, changes in pressure cushion can impact on that. So when you're making that measurement, just make allowances for those possibilities if you're just going to have a fixed height worktop where people can get their knees underneath. The other thing that can be forgotten, but is really important to measure, is the projection of your feet, especially for people who are in wheelchairs, and the foot plates. So there's something about measuring the full projection of your feet from the back of the foot to the front of the foot, but also the height of the foot plate, the height of the foot from the floor to the foot plate. So in a full kitchen adaptation design, you would be considering that measurement is kind of crucial, where in the parts of the kitchen where you haven't got the knee space underneath, but you've got some base units, and it's that shape, that recess, that you need to take account of, which can be the difference between getting closer to those units. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to say, this image has been purely created for illustration of someone sitting, and although you might sometimes occasionally come across people who've resorted to using a wheeled office chair to manage, and it may very well work for the occasional person. This option is not recommended by OTs as a safe option due to the potential risks for someone who's unstable, who might just sit back on the chair and it goes scooting off, and you might end up sitting on the floor. So we're just using this image as a way to show you actually what's really useful about this is what it does demonstrate quite clearly is that being seated severely limits how much you could do in a conventional kitchen that has not been adapted. Have the next slide, please. And similarly, these images show how much limit there is and how much this person can actually reach anything if she's reliant on something like this. Have the next slide, please. In terms of measuring people who use wheelchairs, you need to consider all the different factors associated with why they need to use the wheelchair that might impact on their strength, range of movement, and so on. This person, this is Rob, and he's had a C5, C6 incomplete spinal cord injury. He's in his usual wheelchair and he's demonstrating how he moves around and what he's able to do. Despite his injury, he has good upper body strength, range of movement, and core stability. However, he does have some reduced hand function. So, for example, here, this is impacting on his ability to lift the kettle out of the sink once it's full. And you can see that he's also unable to get near to the sink as there's not space underneath. So there are some immediate and obvious changes that could be made in terms of the position of the tap and the space under the sink. So a tap that's nearer to the worktop could allow him to put the kettle on the worktop and fill it without needing to lift it out of the sink, for example. Equally, you can only just see it behind him, there's an oven under the base unit, which presents some significant risks and difficulties for lifting things, hot pots out of the oven. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Sometimes the most complex of injuries present with simpler solutions, and we can see that Rob has significant range of movement, but his greatest challenge is around holding and lifting items and finger control. So he will require an environment that enables him to manage this and use his gadgets and new techniques more effectively. And this is an example of what I've found, especially for people like Rob, is this business of the real benefits of having storage that you can pull up towards you, makes it easier for you to control what strength you have because you're using the power in your core. Thank you. Next slide. Another way of measuring is to actually do it with somebody actually sitting at a table, and if that's more convenient, might also be the only option to make it easier for you to consider and perhaps replicate some tasks that the person might want to do. Thank you. Next slide, please. In terms of considering turning circles, for wheelchair users, there's some standards that you can refer to in category 3 of the Part M of the building regulations and in the wheelchair housing design guide. However, these do tend to be minimum and very many people need more space than the standard. So they're really good as a starting point, but what's really valuable and what you can do as occupational therapists when you're working with people in their own homes is that you have the chance to make recommendations for bespoke adaptations that are suited to that individual situation. And it will also depend on the person's ability, for example, how good they are at operating their wheelchair, what type of wheelchair they've got. So it really is worth taking some detailed measurements of the actual turning circle, the space they require to move between different parts of the kitchen, how they change direction, how they move between rooms from kitchen to dining, or if dining isn't an option actually in the kitchen, and the space that might be needed for other equipment, and perhaps space for someone to be assisted with certain parts of the way they use that kitchen, so carers, and perhaps parking space for other equipment. Sometimes a kitchen's near the front entrance, and then you might have an outdoor wheelchair and also whether perhaps that's somebody who's a part-time wheelchair user who might sometimes use a seat or a perching stool or transfer onto a chair. Thank you. Next slide, please. So why is it important for you to take measurements of the space and not just rely on a surveyor? As I mentioned, you aren't a technical officer, and you don't need to be an expert in technical drawings. And the measurements don't have to be really, really precise, but your measurements, observations, and with consent from the client, any photographs you take will be a way for you to document the existing environment, and it will help you to think about possible solutions. And simple sketches can be used to discuss the options with the person before you involve a surveyor or a specialist kitchen provider. And you just need to bear in mind that it's not just the kitchen, it's how it relates to the rest of the house. So it's where it is in relation to adjacent rooms, how you get into it and out of it. Is the kitchen, for example, a direct route from another part of the house to the back door or the garden? So there's something about thinking about the layout and the risks of people coming through the space, and that can be potential obstacle and risks in terms of collisions and so on. You know, all these things, it's, you know, what you can do is try out measuring your own kitchen. It's really good practice. And many of us working from home, in my experience, you can never take too many measurements. The worst thing is if you're going to visit someone at home and you get the chance to take these measurements, depending on the situation, you don't want to get back to the office and forget that you don't know where the door is or the window is or something, you know, so it's about taking photographs, all panning around the room and so on. So I would recommend the way you start is by sketching out a plan, the shape of the kitchen, where the doors and windows are, the door opening widths, then the layout, the worktops, the table, any tables that might be in that space. Mark the key elements, the oven, the hob, the fridge, and so on, and perhaps position of key switches and sockets. Then once you've got a bit of a sketch layout, then you can mark in the heights and the depths and the measurements, the heights of the worktops from the floor, also the heights of the wall cupboards from the worktop. That can be a crucial measurement where you can make recommendations perhaps for cupboards to be lowered if you've got enough space for a kettle, so long as you've got enough space between the bottom of the cupboard and the worktop. There's some real benefits in having lower wall cupboards. You also obviously have to take account of measuring the clear floor space, how much space is actually there and how much space compared to the measurements you've taken of the person and the way they move around the kitchen. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the following slides are some examples of different kitchens to think about what we might observe in terms of the pros and cons of the existing environment before you start to think about changing anything. For example, on this one, you can see there's an L-shaped layout with a potential for a continuous surface between the hob and the sink and the preparation area. But there's some details you might consider. The hob is a gas hob with raised rings, which could be an issue for people with limited grip if they're moving heavy pans that might tip or spill. The oven is below counter level, which could be difficult for many people to safely lift out heavy hot pans and so on. You can just about see on the left-hand side, there is a high loop tap, which can be very useful, as I mentioned earlier, if it's in the right position next to a worktop, so you don't have to lift kettles or pans when you're filling them, so that you can easily move them across to the hob. There is some task lighting in this kitchen, which is very good, and because of the way it's positioned, the position of the lighting is crucial in kitchens sometimes, especially. This is good because the lighting is below the cupboards and is directed onto the task areas, such as the sink and a preparation area, which avoids the risk of overhead lighting, which causes you to throw your own shadow onto the task area, which kind of removes the benefits of the lighting. Another issue in this kitchen is there's a little island in the center, which could be a useful feature. However, it could also be an obstacle and not particularly convenient for somebody with limited mobility if you're trying to use it to prepare food, and then you've got to carry it across to the food cooking areas. Next slide, please. This one is really large and spacious, a great starting point with open plan leading, you can see just about to the left at the rear. There doesn't seem to be doors connecting it to the other parts of the house. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious changes in levels. There's an option also to use the table to prepare food. But as you can see at the rear of this image, the oven is still under the counter, which might be an issue for this business of bending down and lifting things out of the oven. There's a really good natural light and this high loop tap and open access to the adjacent rooms. But just as a kind of reminder, this is really about documenting what you've seen. It's really worth turning around, and I'd really like to know what you can see in the other direction. So that's the thing that happens when you get back and somebody says, I'm planning this kitchen, but you don't know where the door is, for example, or there might be a change in level just behind you or something like that. So you can't really take too many photos or too many measurements. Next slide, please. And this one looks really sleek and smart and contemporary. And you can just about see on the left, the oven is in a housing, and there does appear to be a worktop immediately adjacent to the oven, which makes it much easier and safer to take something out of an oven and transfer it onto the adjacent worktop. And as you probably know, a recommendation for accessible kitchens is for the ovens to have you need to have a side hung door so that you don't have a door that comes down, which might be hot in front of you if you're using a wheelchair. What's recommended is a side hung door that opens towards the adjacent worktop. And of course, nowadays there's some really great products like the ones with the or you can have the slide away door. So then you're immediately removing the risk of the hot door away from you. This layout might be an issue. I'm going to talk a bit about working triangles shortly in more detail, but the issue with this kitchen is that, as you can see, the sink's on the left and the hob's on the right. And so this is requiring somebody to turn back and forth, which potentially presents some more issues in relation to transferring pans and so on, and possibly spills, which potentially cause slips and so on. The other thing that's not particularly a focus of this session that's just worth considering is that although this is beautiful and sleek and contemporary, it may present issues for people with cognitive impairments and in particular people with dementia, in terms of being able to find key things in the kitchen and not realizing that there's things behind the doors and so on. Have the next slide, please. Now this is an example. It's a much smaller kitchen and perhaps more like the sorts of kitchens that many of us are likely to come across. There doesn't appear to be in this kitchen room for a table or any way that you could sit, prepare food. And it looks as though this might be the route from the rest of the house to the back door, which can also, as I was saying, if you have a layout which the main route is there's traffic going through and you're trying to prepare something, there's potential issues for collisions and so on. The worktop space also looks a bit limited and possibly narrow and is being used for lots of other essential items, which possibly indicates the need to think about specific task areas where that you need to make sure there's space to do things easily. The oven is also under the worktop height again. You can also see in the doorway on the right at the back of this image that there's a threshold to the next room which is raised, which has obvious issues in terms of trip hazards, especially if you're carrying anything like hot meals or drinks, and would also rule out the potential for providing perhaps a trolley to help someone take something into a dining area. Thank you. Next slide, please. When you start thinking about designing a new layout, a key principle that is used in the design of all kitchens is to start by considering what's called the working triangle. And this is the shape formed by travel between key facilities in the kitchen. So namely, the key things are the fridge, the sink, and the hob. And you can see the blue triangles in these layouts is indicating that, that travel, really. The intention is to consider how this works in different layouts and what is the most efficient use of the body within the space in terms of ergonomics. And it enables the body to move in between and complete the required tasks in the most time and space efficient manner if you get it right. So it's a principle that's used in kitchen design. But when you're thinking about, so some of these layouts may very well be fine. However, when you're thinking about, if you combine that with people's physical limitations, you want to really kind of aim for a much more confined working triangle that allows you to transfer things safely and so on. So the following slides show some examples of the working triangles in different layouts and what might be issues for people with physical impairments. Thank you. Next slide. The purpose of this, so you can see here from these layouts, there's a U shape, there's a galley, there's an L shape, and there's an L shape that's got an island. The triangles indicate the travel between these key facilities, and you need to think about how the person moves about in the space available with different abilities, limitations, mobility aids, and potential energy issues, what the person wants to be able to do and which parts of that space they need to be able to access, and the location and access of things like storage of pots, pans, cutlery, hot and cold food, a microwave, for example. So how much, and also really how much can you feasibly change? Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So a simple layout like this, just all on one long run, can be fine, but you need to consider, for example, space to transfer. This one is quite short, so there's not much, doesn't appear to be much space to transfer, for example, a pan onto a adjacent worktop next to the hob, and there doesn't seem to be perhaps very much space for food preparations, but perhaps that would work on the top of the fridge, depending on whether the fridge is a fridge freezer or so on. The other thing about long straight layouts is, of course, they can be more tricky for a wheelchair user, because it's harder to move up and down like that than it is to turn in an L shape. Next slide, please. You need also to consider here this layout it's got like the other picture of the kitchen. That person using that sink and hob is going to have to keep turning back and forth, and this could impact on standing balance and risks of transferring things. Next slide, please. This L shape is probably the most useful layout, especially for wheelchair users, but unfortunately the island presents a particular risk for the same reasons. If the island's got the hob, it might be useful if it was an eating area, for example, but there's obvious risks in going back and forth between these spaces. And it's also a kind of lost opportunity to use the L shape to provide the continuous surface between the hob and the sink. Next slide, please. This U shape would be much easier and safer to use if you have a direct and continuous surface between the hob and the sink. For example, in this L-shaped corner, this also gives you the potential to make this L shape height adjustable. And that would allow you to account, especially in for an adaptation in the kitchen that's going to have multiple users. So you could make a case, although there is significant cost, you can make case for that if that's what the situation needs and there's going to be different users. So the whole of that L shape can go up and down, which means that you're not having any issues with tipping or anything, but it can be used by different users. Next slide, please. And so similarly, this one, is essentially the most compact and has all the key elements within a convenient space, which allows, especially wheelchair users, it's kind of easier to swivel around. It also addresses that issue of potential collisions that I talked about. If this kitchen space is part of a room, which is a route through the house to the back door, for example, somebody can be operating in that space with less risk of collisions. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about the solutions, the rest of the training talks much more in detail about the solutions. But if you're involved in making assessments in terms of funding for DFGs, then as OTs, we're always what we're really being asked in that situation is whether what we're making recommendations for is necessary and appropriate. In terms of feasibility, we'll be working with the grants officers to consider what is reasonable and practical. So the solutions will depend on the individual situations, and being able to prepare and provide meals might not be really very important to that person, or they may have such significant physical, sensory or cognitive impairments which might limit them in what they're able to do, but they might just need to be supported to do something very simple. So if we want to make recommendations for extensive adaptations, we need to have a good rationale for why we think it is necessary and appropriate to that individual in their situation, and how much we can propose can support their ability, for example, to continue their role as a parent or a provider, part of a family, for example, or be less reliant on assistance from formal or informal care and support, all factors which would support making a case for perhaps more extensive adaptations. What I think really is that the great thing about having the chance to advise on kitchen adaptations is that it's a chance to use our expertise as OTs to consider how the design of the environment can support that person to be able to do what they want to do in their everyday lives. Thank you. If you've got any questions, I think we've got a little bit of time left.
Hi, Marney. Thank you very much for that in-depth presentation. Lots of things going on in the chat box, lots of Q&As and people helping each other out. So I've got a couple of questions for both yourself and Claire, by the looks of it. So I'll keep with yourself first, just on a couple of the questions that Sally's passed to me. Do you cover visual impairments in the course, or when you're assessing somebody with a complex visual impairment? Would you do that yourself? Or do you feel you've got enough knowledge to look into that working with the client? Or do you generally do visual impairment, working with visual impairment officers or somebody from the RNIB? How would you look at visual impairment? I know you touched on it about task lighting, but if it was quite complex or they had quite a and maybe an unusual condition rather than something more like macular degeneration that we're used to, how would you approach that, please?
Was that for me or?
For you, Marney, if possible.
That's a very good question. I think that, I mean, I've always liked to, if there are specialists available who can give extra information, but certainly what's very useful, I also rely on, is some really good evidence-based specialist guidance from places like Thomas Pocklington, and where they make detailed recommendations and guidance for levels of lighting. I think one of the things about sight loss in particular is that what they say is that it's about making the lighting flexible to, it's about individual assessments as well. So I think it's a good question. I think if there were visual impairment officers or whatever they might be called locally that you can work together with, that would really inform what you're doing. But there are some basic principles in relation to things like, which are all in those guidance about tonal contrast lighting, and things like avoiding large areas of shiny surfaces, which then cause reflections and glare and confusions, and avoiding things that, like I said, about creating shadows can be it's such a simple thing really, about where where you put the light. If you put the light above your head and then you're looking down, the shadow's going. So I think it's a combination really, but like, it's all about personal individual assessment.
Brilliant, thank you. So just to mention, you mentioned Thomas Pocklington. So just in case people haven't heard it, it's the Thomas Pocklington Trust, and they've got some good guides there about the lumens and different levels of lighting in different parts of the home. So I've used that for our practice as well. It's very good because it also gives you the maximum lumens as well, which I thought was quite interesting. Because as you rightly said, if you put too many in, it's going to cause a bigger problem in some instances, which is very interesting. Fantastic. Thank you very much. We've got another question. You mentioned door opening widths. Could you explain what you mean by that? So I know the answer, how I would assess a door opening, but how would you do it? So if you're quite new to this and you're in a property and you've taken your pictures, done your measurements, how would you measure a door width?
How would you measure it?
Yes.
The measurement that you need to take is between the face of the door. So you open the door as far as it will go. So some doors won't open very well anyway. They might be, and in a kitchen, they quite often might be opening against the work counter that's in the, so that you take the real measurement, which is the real measurement between the space. It's the space between the face of the door and the door jamb, and not the door frame. But so you take account of the width of the door to see, and also in terms of the person, how easy it is, in terms of a functional assessment to get through that door or not. There are some standards, there are some standards in the building regulation which say what the minimum door opening width should be, but it's what you call the clear opening width. That's what you want to achieve. And it's really worth knowing that, because technical officers, or sometimes people don't fully understand, and they just think of it as the door opening, and it's
because we're often told 900 door width for an 838 minimum clear opening, and obviously you can still get that wrong if you're looking at the wrong angle. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Just one more quick question for you, Marney. Then I've got a couple for Claire, if I may. We've had a question. How far in advance would you look to the future for the client? Does that make sense? So if you've got a client with a progressive condition, how far in advance, or what would you be looking at in terms of the recommendations for the adaptation?
Well, that's a kind of big question, because some people have different views about, people can have progressive conditions, and it's not always easy to know how fast the progression might be, or it depends on the condition, but I don't know whether I'd put an actual time limit on it, to be honest. I'm not sure, actually.
Because the disabled facilities grant often is 5 years, isn't it? That's what they sign. However, if somebody's private, to be equitable, it should be the same, shouldn't it? But like you said, it's very challenging, because we could visit somebody with motor neuron disease, with Parkinson's disease, with MS, especially neurological conditions, or maybe a mental health like Alzheimer's dementia, and find that there's no way we can sign a form to guarantee that they wouldn't move in 5 years, because they might go into care. But I think it's a good question. So the answer is there isn't a no.
Well, there isn't a set question, but I suppose what I try to do, and partly because I've worked a lot on new build housing, is that one way of thinking about it to me is to think about considering a design that is flexible and adaptable to changing needs, so that things could be adapted in the future more easily. Or another way of looking at it is, for me, is that if, say, you were doing a shower adaptation, well, to me, a shower adaptation is the safest. So you could think about it as, well, you have to do the assessment appropriate to the level of need. But however, if there's less risk associated with a level access flush floor shower than there is with a cubicle or a shower over the bath. So does that make sense? Sorry.
Total sense, yeah. It's about proportionality, but also considering what could be, and then just trying to get something that will encapsulate many different possibilities, I suppose. So yeah, 100%. Thank you so much, Marney. Just a couple of questions for Claire, because we are on 2 o'clock, so I'll be very quick, Claire. I'll ask you them in one go, if I may, just for speed. So first one is rough costs for the course, and if there will be a discount for learners. The second question is on group sizes. So how many would you envisage would be in the group? And if it was to be face-to-face or due to COVID, would it be online? And I think, just looking at that, group sizes, discounts and prices. And is there a discount for teams as well, or is it individual, if that makes sense?
Oh gosh, there's more than two in one go, Stuart. So the courses, for cost-wise, you're best off emailing in, because yes, we do commission courses for people. Generally, we have a maximum rule of 12 learners per session, but obviously in COVID times, that's sometimes reduced owing to safe distances. So we're working on about an 8 learner to trainer ratio at the moment. We are delivering face-to-face from January with restrictions in place. So we are doing extra measures to reduce the risks. You have got a discount. So for those of you attending the webinar today, if you're interested in going on to the Level 5 course, we offer a 10% discount if you book before March 2021 next year. And we'll send that out to you in an email as well, so that you've got the details of that. But yeah, the best bet is to email in inquiries at dlf.org.uk for pricing, because it depends on how many modules and where and what and how. But you can book on individually or as a group, so the different options. I think that was everything.
That was, yeah. So just finally, thank you very much both. Just a quick one to remind people that we've got the next session in bathroom design, 20th of January. 18th of February is practical assessment for home adaptation, so access solutions, so looking at access in and out of the property. And on the 18th of March is multi-levels, so that'll be your through floor lifts, stair lifts, that type of thing as well. So please have a look at the OTAC website, www.otac.org.uk. They're all listed there, and you can register for all 3 in one go. Many, many thanks to Claire and Marney for allowing us to run this session on your behalf from the team at OTAC. And thank you very much for all the questions. We will have a copy of the chat box, which we'll send across to Claire and Marney. If there's any questions we've missed or anything that they feel that you would benefit from, they will drop you an email and answer any questions. Certificates should arrive within the next 48 hours automatically. If they don't, drop me an email and we'll sort that out for you. Just to let you know, we do close as a business this afternoon. However, we are obviously going to deal with any certificate issues. So don't be alarmed if you do miss your certificate at the moment. They will come to you. So thank you very much again. Have a fantastic Christmas and a happy new year. And I'll see you in January 2021. Goodbye.